Well, I'm just going to say welcome, and you get the cushy chairs this time because we're in a different room. You can maneuver and rock and roll in them.
Could we bring the screen in here sometime for?
Well, the screen is connected into the wall, but we do have one that is, yes, maybe for the book to movie we could do that because we have a smaller group. We could certainly do that.
A little bit.
Well, I'm not going to go over everything that we're doing this month like I normally do, but I will say we do have another speaker coming in May, and she's going to be talking about the culinary history of Iowa. So she'll be talking about Maid-Rites and pork tenderloins and all that kind of stuff. So, and she said she has information about history of food in Iowa from all corners of Iowa. So it should be interesting. Her name is Darcy Malsby, and she wrote a book, and we have the book here. So you can check that out at some point and take a look at it. It has recipes and then history that goes alongside those recipes. Today we have Tommy Murray, and we are going to have, excuse me, his book in our collection too that can be checked out. We got one today. He was so gracious to give one to the library and sign it. He wrote the book Father, Sons, and the Holy Ghost of Baseball, and he is going to tell you all about his book and his inspiration.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This is the 14th presentation that I've given in Northwest Iowa since Sunday, and this one means a lot to me. So I'd like to begin this one dedicating this special presentation, which is being filmed, to the greatest generation, which is about 90% of the people in this room, and especially the Lenans. Joanne Lenan was my mother's best and dearest friend, and if you get to know her, you can understand she's an incredible listener and just the best and most wonderful friend you could ever have. So with that, I would like to say that before I came down to the cities, or before I came down to Northwest Iowa, I checked this book out from my library, which is about 2 blocks from my home in Shoreview, Minnesota, just north of St. Paul. It says, How to Write Like Tolstoy. And Tolstoy said, before you write, make certain that you have a good story. And every good story is a variation of 1 or 2 themes, or hopefully both. And the 2 themes are, 1, a person makes a trip, or 2, a stranger comes to town. So this afternoon, I want to talk about both of those. My story has both of those, but I want to start off with a person makes a trip. All of you have this, I call it my audio visual. This is a Tommy Murray, for whom I am named. He is my namesake. And in 1943, we were at war. They rationed gas. And he was a pitcher on a baseball team that was very good. He was from Bancroft, Iowa, and Bancroft had one of the best teams in the state. Up until 1943, they had 2 different ways that they could determine who was a state championship. They had a Catholic school tournament and a public school tournament. But in 1943, they allowed the Catholic schools to play with the public schools. And Bancroft, which had a long history of really good baseball teams, and I'm going to pass around a newspaper that will show you that history. Bancroft, they would play American Legion tournaments all over the country and win them. So when they allowed the Catholic schools to play to the public schools, Bancroft immediately went to the state championship game. They collected all their cards so that they could get enough gas, and they went down to Des Moines and they played a team called Atkins over by Cedar Rapids. My Uncle Tommy, my namesake, pitched. He was a left-handed pitcher. He struck out 11 people that day. He stole 4 bases. He had 2 hits. And Bancroft St. John won the first Catholic school championship in the state of Iowa. He was a hero when he went back to Bancroft, Iowa, population 732. Everybody loved him. But he wanted to be more than a baseball hero. He wanted to be an American hero, an Army hero, because his friends were lying so that they could get into the draft early and go over and fight the Germans and fight the Japanese, and he wanted to be like one of those guys, a real hero. There was just one problem. He had severe juvenile arthritis, and the Army said, you can't come in. So my grandfather, who was very influential, got him, pulled strings and got him into the Army. And in gratitude, he volunteered for the most dangerous job that there is, that being a flamethrower. They put a propane tank on your back, and it was his job to go up front and try to frighten and scare these Japanese out of ditches and caves and holes in the ground. They called them pillboxes, with a 25-foot long flame, and scare him. He was shot and killed in the Philippines in 1945, shortly before the end of the war. He almost made it to the end of the war. And as a matter of fact, he wrote a letter to my dad saying, well, first of all, the sergeant said, don't put anything in these letters that could scare your parents or your brothers or sisters, so keep it light. And so he wrote about the nice climate in the Philippines, and that they had had a pig that they had eaten on a spit, and he talked about that. The only negative line he put in the letter is, don't join the Army, they treat you like dogs. So, but otherwise it was all very positive. And I still have that letter. I meant to run it off so I could pass that around, but I just didn't get around to it. So he was shot and killed. Back then, the Army sent they didn't have enough soldiers to come and knock on a door, so they sent a Western Union telegram, and it went to the most important person in Bancroft, Iowa. That was the parish priest. He got it first. And in Bancroft, it's a tradition that when you find out somebody's died, you honor them by going over and ringing the bells, however old they are. So he rang the bells 20 times. Everybody in the school and everybody in the surrounding area knew that a 20-year-old had been killed. They figured it was somebody in the war, so they all waited, and then he came over and he pulled my dad and my Uncle Jimmy out of class and told them the news. His death was very difficult for the Murray family because the Murrays are, that family, it's kind of cerebral, kind of sober, very straight-laced. And this guy was a gambler and a joker and kept everybody loose, so it was devastating to the Murray family. It was very devastating to my grandfather because he felt guilty that he had gotten him into the Army. So my grandpa had a literal broken heart. He would die of a broken heart about 4 years later as a result of that. So I need to tell you about the day that announcement came back. My dad came home. This was one of my dad's best friends. My dad came home and wept, and Fort Dodge Public called. Now, Fort Dodge Public had won the baseball tournament the year before, and Bancroft had been waiting to play them, and Fort Dodge called my grandpa and said, Mr. Murray, you have our deepest sympathies, but we can't play this game tonight. We're going to forfeit. You guys win. And my grandpa said, oh no. There are some things in life that are so important that we play regardless of what the tragedy is, and baseball is one of them. So I need to tell you that then my grandpa told my dad to get in his uniform. He would play third base, and I had a cousin named Devine, John Devine, who played shortstop. Bancroft played Fort Dodge Public and beat them, and they won that game. So there are some places, and Bancroft is one, where baseball isn't just a fun sport that kids go out and play. It's an obsession. It's life or death. It's a religion, and it really is. In Bancroft, they have an expression, there's only 4 things that you can do in Bancroft: watch television, drink, pray, or play baseball. And so it is important. And if we were to take the time and I were to ask all of you, what's your legacy? How do you want to be remembered, if and when you ever die? What do you want people to say about you? What's your contribution? There would be 15 different responses in this room. Yours, Denise, yours might be music, and yours might be some of the recipes that you worked with and left with your kids, and some of the stories you tell, and yours might be the Christmas stockings that you knit, whatever. All of us have something different. In Bancroft, if you ask that question, all the guys immediately say, baseball. That's my legacy. I played baseball. I was on a state championship team. I played first base. So everybody answers the question the same way. And so baseball was very, very important. And So in 1948, when they brought my uncle's body back to Bancroft, they also got a $10,000 life insurance settlement from the federal government. And my grandpa, who was fairly wealthy, took that money and he donated, I think it was 41 acres for the baseball park. And then he built this magnificent grandstand with that $10,000, which would be worth $100,000 nowadays. And that grandstand this is it. This is a picture, it's from a print called Field of Dreams Forever by Spencer's very own Jean Rooney Olson. She was originally from Armstrong. She painted this. And I called her one day and I said, Jean, this was a painting that my dad had in his living room. It meant a lot to him. And I said, I'm just going to be honest with you. Name your price and I'll pay it. And to put this on the cover of my book. And she said, you know what? I'd like to give it to you for free. So she gave us this cover for free. And I've told people it's so good that you don't even need to read my story. If you just sit for 20 minutes and look at this picture, you'll see the story of Bancroft baseball. It's all right here. So that's the backdrop of a place where baseball is a religion. And that's the environment my dad came from. My dad left Bancroft and he came to Storm Lake and he was a baseball coach and a basketball coach and a social studies teacher and a gym teacher. He was one of a very few lay staff that were at St. Mary's. We were trying to think. There was a lay woman named Ruth Miller who every day, I think I was in class with Colleen for Ruth Miller. Fifth grade. And every day after lunch, we would end our recess by hitting the floor, a wooden floor, on our knees, and we'd say a whole rosary. That was Ruth Miller's class. And then my dad was the lay male, and he did all the coaching. So I literally grew up in a rectory above Monsignor Ives's house. I don't know if you knew my parents.
Well, you were born when they lived up there.
Yep. And so when my mom needed a babysitter, she'd put me in a stroller and wheel me over to the high school, right into a class with a nun who might have 30 kids, and say, here you go, I've got to go shopping. So I grew up in St. Mary's High School in the classroom. I grew up in the gym where my dad was the coach, hearing basketballs bounce, and I grew up in the Memorial Baseball Park down on Lakeshore Drive there, down near the lake. I was as I say, the ball boy. And I idolized my dad, followed him around all over Northwest Iowa. That's part of the reason I came back on this little tour. I went back to all those towns, and I did either readings or signings in all of them, 14 in all. So this morning I started off in Early, Iowa. I went to Fonda. Fonda had this school called OLGC. I was in Fonda, went to Newell. All these incredible memories. My parents just to give you an idea of how times have changed, in Storm Lake, the Illinois Central came through Storm Lake and it went to Newell. My parents put the kids in pajamas and took us over to the train depot and put us on a train. There were 6 of us at the time in our pajamas. And then they would drive over to Newell and wait for the train to come and then take us off the train. Just 6 little kids.
Your mom and I took you kids the very last run.
Yes.
We did. We took all the Murray kids and all the Linneham kids, and we took the run over there because that was the first stop.
Before they stopped.
That's where they stopped, yeah.
So it was I grew up in a place where everybody was above average and there was no unhappiness. Everything was really beautiful. Everybody was very happy. It was a dream-like existence. There were a couple little things on the horizon, though, that were happening. Number one, we kept having these kids. I would be eventually the oldest of 10. I had a little sister who died at birth. And my dad was not making a lot of money at St. Mary's. It was almost kind of a volunteer position. And so he had to leave that position, and he got a postmaster's job in Storm Lake. And then things were good again. He was making enough money that everything was going well until 1968. My dad got fired from the postmaster's job in Storm Lake. And he got fired with 20,000 other postmasters across the United States who had the bad fortune of being categorized as Democrats. Richard Nixon came into office and he said, we're going to replace each and every one of you. So here we were again, all, my siblings and myself, and my dad looked around and he found a teaching job down in Burlington, Iowa, and we went down to Burlington, and things were beginning to get a little shaky because my dad was a baseball player. He was a baseball coach. I told you I traveled around with him, and the expectation was that I was going to be a baseball player. And look at me, I'm 6'4" of twisted steel and sex appeal. You would think that I'm going to be a star, right? There was just one little problem, and I'll pass this around. It's this thing right here. It's really pouring rain outside. This little thing right here, a baseball, they're very hard. And I refused. When I was out in the field, I told the story about a guy named Merle Oxley, who was a former Marine, who was a Little League coach, who had a crew cut that was so sharp, he could trim his hedges with it, just like this. And go right down a really sharp guy, but a typical sort of hard male that wanted everybody to be a hard male. And he would hit ground balls to us for Little League as hard as he could, and he said, I want you to get down, genuflect, and collect that ball, but get in front of it and block it. Just in case it takes a bad bounce and it hits you, then you've stopped it. Now, most of the little boys in Storm Lake did that, but I didn't like the feeling of that, I'll pass that around, hitting me in the chest or in the Adam's apple, or God forbid this nose. This nose is big enough as it is. I didn't need that thing swelling up even more. So instead of getting in front of it, I stuck my glove out like this. And sometimes that ball got by me. And when it was time for me to get up to bat, I would, if the pitcher was Don Lenand there, I would get up like this, and as soon as Don gets his arm ready, I'm starting to get a little nervous, and my knees are starting to shake just like the Cowardly Lion. And as he takes a deep breath, I'm already starting to edge out of the batter's box. And as soon as that ball comes my way, I've already taken my left foot and pulled it way over towards third base, just in case that ball comes at me. So when the ball finally does come across the plate, I have to reach my bat out like this and just kind of wave at it. I couldn't hit the ball. I was afraid of the ball. And at every presentation I've done, there's usually one person who says, you know what, I was afraid too, and that's why I couldn't play baseball. But there was just nothing I could do about that. And the problem is, this guy that I loved and that I, wanted to please and make happy, unfortunately, it broke his heart. So when I went to him as a sophomore in high school and said, Dad, I'm sorry, I just cannot play this game anymore. I can play basketball. I enjoyed that, and I'm not afraid of the basketball, but it's just that baseball. It broke his heart because in Bancroft, they do play basketball, but only as a means to get in shape to play baseball. So baseball is always the highest good. So it did break his heart. I even tried playing football, but if you can imagine what a broomstick looks like with a football helmet on, that's what I looked like. And I wasn't very good in football either. But I did play, I tell people I played football at Notre Dame. I don't tell them that it was Burlington Notre Dame High School, and that I only played 2 downs. And I'd like to tell you about those 2 downs right now. The first one was, there wasn't much about it, but the second down, I always sat on the bench, but a coach named Harold Tackleson, who had been coaching at the high school for, 40 years, he was a legend. He retired from the high school and he came over, he was almost 80 years old. And he called out, he said, Murray, get over here. And this was a big deal because I hadn't been in games, and so my friends looked at me and I came over and he said, all I want you to do is when the ball is hiked, go in 3 feet and just stand there. Can you do that? And I go, yeah. And he said, show me. Well, by this time my friends were laughing. And so I had to demonstrate this. So I said, okay, 1, 2, 3. I planted my feet and I waited. And he goes, get in there and don't screw up. So I went in, they hiked the ball, and I did exactly what he told me to do. 1, 2, 3, planted my feet and I waited. And I was standing there like this, and the quarterback was way running on the other side of the field. And here I am, already looking pretty foolish, but thinking, you know, I can't just stand here. So I started chasing after the quarterback. They did something called a wide reverse, where he ran to the other end of the field, handed it to a wide receiver who came running right by me. I was about as fast and mobile as that red chair. So when this guy came running by me and ran right through the hole that I was supposed to be protecting, all I saw was the back of his uniform as he ran 89 yards to a West Burlington touchdown. I still see him to this day, and I still can't catch him. And I still remember the reaction of Coach Harold Tackleson as I came back to the sideline. He just pointed to the end of the bench. He didn't say anything. His face was contorted and grimacing, but he didn't say anything. He just pointed. And so I went over and I sat on the end of this bench for the rest of the game against West Burlington. Hi, Gene, come on in. I'll talk to you later, but come in and sit down. So I sat on the end of a very long bench, and I watched the game, or what I could see of the game, because the team was in front of me, and so were the coaches. So I started watching things about the game. I watched fathers up in the stands living vicariously through their sons, through the glory of what their sons were doing on the football field. I watched that, and I watched sons who, when we were in high school, sometimes we were embarrassed by our parents, sometimes we didn't particularly care for them. And I remember watching my friends, though, still looking over their shoulder to make certain that their dad saw them. And I watched the coaches who were seemingly always trying to get something back, some kind of great feeling from winning that they had had either early in their career as a coach or maybe even as a player. It always seemed like they were trying to relive something. So I watched these 3 old coaches. There was one named Tackleson. It's a great football name, isn't it? Harold Tackleson. He was nearly 80 years old. There was a layman, a guy by the name of Al Pershke. And then there was a Catholic priest who actually knew Newt Rockne at Notre Dame. This priest had gone to Notre Dame. He was a very daffy, way out there sort of a priest who could say Mass in around 30 minutes. And because he would very often either forget to say the homily or just skip over the homily. So everybody in Burlington liked to go to Father Harry Ryan's Mass. So I watched all that. And even as a 17-year-old, again, I'm not doing anything else on the bench, I thought to myself, you know, I think that would be a good story someday, to write a story with something about fathers and sons. And, but I didn't know the specifics, but I just thought, I'm going to remember that, fathers and sons. Graduated from Burlington Notre Dame High School, went to the University of St. Thomas, got a job in the Minneapolis Public Schools. I told you I was 6 foot 4 inches of twisted steel and sex appeal. Well, in the Minneapolis Public School, they were always looking for men to come in and work in correctional facilities, juvenile detention centers, chemically dependent programs. I worked at a place called St. Joe's Home for Children, which was an orphanage or shelter. When the police would come across students who were just living on the streets, they'd say, get in the back, we're taking you to St. Joe's. And it was, as they say, three hots and a cot, 3 hot meals and a cot that they could keep warm. And then I was their teacher then during the day. So I met all these kids. And then at night I'd go home and I disciplined myself not to write a lot, but a little. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I started this off about talking about the elements of a good story. Rule number 1 of writing is to start off small. And my goal was to write 1 word every day. And I did it. I did it for a month, just 1 word on this manuscript. And then I eventually grew to 2 words. And then I said, I think I can do a sentence every day. All the while, my psyche and my mind was saying, write more, but I disciplined myself to only write a little bit. Then I started writing a paragraph every day. Finally, I was up to a page. Now, the good news is that's a proven way to write a story. The bad news is it takes 20 years to write a story, but I wrote a story and I had it all ready to go. And I'll tell you the second rule about writing. Now, you know you start small. The second rule of writing is eventually at some point you've got to find somebody to edit your writing. And choose an editor more carefully than you choose a spouse. Nobody told me that rule. So there was a guy named J.F. Powers. I don't know if you know that name. He wrote a book called Mort de Urban in 1962 that won a Pulitzer Prize. Just like my cousin, Art Cullen, for the Storm Lake Times won a Pulitzer Prize. J.F. Powers took the money from that Pulitzer Prize and he took his family over to Ireland. And he lived this glamorous, life in Ireland, and then he ran out of money there, and so he had to write another novel. He wrote one called Wheat That Springeth Green in the late 80s. I bought that, early 90s, I bought that book, and he was doing a reading on Summit Avenue in St. Paul. Has anybody ever been to Summit Avenue? It's this stately avenue with all these big mansions, and I went up to him and to have him sign it. And right after he signed it, I said, Mr. Powers, by the way, I've also written a story about a small town. And I have also written a story about a parish priest. And he said, really, is it good? And I said, yes. And then he asked my brother John, who was standing next to me, he said, is it really good? And John said, yes. And he said, would you like me to critique it? And I said, sure. So this was right around Christmas. I went to Byerly's. That's a very, very nice store in the Twin Cities. I bought this big tin of Danish pastry, and I put it in a box with my manuscript. It was about 400 pages, and I mailed it to him. And I just had the greatest feeling that this was going to be the best thing that ever happened to me, that he was going to say he loved it, that he was going to say, I hope you don't mind, but I contacted a producer, a movie director out of Malibu Beach, California. They're already agreed to do the movie. I just couldn't wait. And it was all going to happen at Christmas time. There'd be snow falling in the background. And I got the package back and I opened it up and it looked like he had taken a ketchup bottle and squirted it on each page. Every page was just filled with red, right up to page 50. And then it stopped. So I went right to page 50, and there were some comments that were, nowadays they call it flaming. Everything was in capital letters, and there were lots of exclamation marks. And he said, this is horrific. This is really terrible. Life is too short. I had to stop here. And then there were two questions. Why are you punishing the reader, and why are you punishing yourself? So I took this manuscript and I went over to my wife and I said, I've got good news and bad news. And she said, well, tell me the bad news first. And I just presented this to her and she looked through and she said, well, I liked your story. Well, I didn't care if my wife liked it. I wanted J.F. Powers to like it. And I said, Mary Ann, I'm done. It's over. This guy did me a huge favor. I am going to take this and put it in a box, and I'm going to go to bed at night. Instead of staying up late, I'm going to get a good night's sleep. I'm not going to be worrying about writing down words. I'm done. It's over. He did me a huge favor. And that's what I did. I put it in a box, and I forgot about it until my dad, who was getting to the age of about 84 or 85, started forgetting things. And when my mom died, he couldn't even remember the name of my mother, who had given him 10 children. And then he started forgetting the names of his children. And so what I had to do with him is, again, now I'm the oldest of 9, I became kind of like a personal care assistant, a PCA with him. I was with him most of the days. He was able to stay by himself at night. And my sisters would call generally every day. And I'd always say, Dad, it's Ann. She's calling from Milwaukee. And we had a picture of all the baby pictures. And so I'd have to find Ann, and I'd say, Dad, it's Ann. And then he'd look at me, and then I'd go over and I would open up a big booklet of a picture of Ann now with her husband and her kids. And I'd say, see, Dad, Ann from Milwaukee. She's married to Dan Baker. These are her kids. Then I'd give him the phone, and he would talk. I don't know if he remembered who Ann was, but he would conduct a conversation with her. You never knew. My dad was he was a little bit, different or unique that way. And then he'd hang up the phone. If Bill Dudding from Bancroft, Iowa, who played on baseball teams with my dad, called, my dad immediately knew who Bill Dudding was, what position he played on, what game that they had won down in New Orleans to win the National American Legion tournament. And so that part of his brain was completely untouched. Dementia took everything except his memories of baseball and of Bancroft, which I guess that sometimes happens, but that's how important baseball was to him. So my plan was then, I recognized all this and I said, you know what, J.F. Powers can go soak his head. I'm going to go ahead and publish this thing anyway. And so at the time, I'm a Catholic, but this is it's a Buddhist bracelet. And it's to remind you that when things are ready, they manifest themselves. Things will just happen. And the moment I made that decision that I was going to print up one copy and give it to my dad and just say, here you go, Dad, I love you, thanks. This is a keepsake for that time we had together when you were in Storm Lake, and it's a remembrance of what happened in Bancroft. As soon as I made that decision, things just started to fall in place. One of the things that happened, I had a cousin named Pat McTigg who lived in San Francisco, and he and his wife made an arrangement with each other that if he died first, she would take his life savings, which was minimal. He liked to have fun. He enjoyed to have a Budweiser or 2 or 3 or 13 or 14 every night. And she would take his life savings and combine it with hers, and then when she died, they were going to give it to a Seeing Eye Foundation in San Francisco. Very noble, worthy cause. If she died first, he would take her considerable life savings as a nurse and combine it with his $150 and distribute it to all the nieces and nephews that he had. Thank God she died first, and thank God that Pat, I hate to say this, died shortly thereafter, because then we got enough money for me to do what's called an indie press. That means indie used to be called Vanity Press, but now we call it indie press because when I was a teacher in the Minneapolis Public Schools, I worked with Prince's mother. You all know who the rock star is, Prince. I worked with his mom. She was a social worker, and I was a special ed teacher. And Prince was the first musician to tell the music industry, I'm just going to do it myself. I'm going to self-create music. Well, I self-published this with the money from Uncle Pat, and I was getting it all ready to go. The publisher said, how many copies are we going to make? And I said, just one. I'm just giving it to one very special person. And they said, oh, come on. And I said, no, really, it's just one. In the process of getting this thing ready to go, my dad passed away. He died of dementia, and there's some things related to that. And so I never did get to walk up to him and say, here you go, Dad, this is for you. But I said, all right, I'm going to give it one to each of my 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls, and just tell them, you know what, this was a way of life that I kind of lived a little bit, and I want you to know about it. The people at the publishing house kept nagging me. They said, you know, you'd be an absolute fool if you don't print up 500 of these copies, because people will buy this. And I said, no, I don't think so. And they said, well, whether you say so or not, it costs the same to print up 200 as it does 4. We're going to print up 200 copies. So I said, all right, go ahead. So I got 200 copies of this, and I started giving them out. I tell people I gave out more copies of this than L. Ron Hubbard did of Dianetics. I don't know if you know L. Ron. That's how he got onto the bestseller. He'd buy thousands and thousands of his own copies of what he wrote and then give them out. I just gave this away. one guy who read it was a Hmong city council person. His name is Blong Yang. Now, we were talking a little bit about the Hmong people before the camera started. At the school that I ended up at, Henry High School, where the last 11 years, almost half the school was Hmong. Now, the Hmong are they originally started off in China, and then the Chinese, they battled with the Chinese, and they came into Laos. The Laotians battled them, and so the Hmong went up into the mountains. So they're a mountain people. And they helped our servicemen who were fighting the North Vietnamese. If a plane went down or something, the Hmong would go out and help them and provide cover for them. The Hmong didn't like the communists either, so they were a real strong ally. There's Hmong in Storm Lake. They work at the packing plant. There's lots of Hmong up in St. Paul. That's the biggest concentration of Hmong people in the United States, and then there's some in California, Fresno. So this Hmong city council member from North Minneapolis, he was one of the guys who got the free books, and he called me up and he said, I love this. I want to buy 200 copies and give them out to people who donate to my campaign and contribute to my campaign. And I said, no, you're just saying that. And he said, get me the copies. I'm not saying it. This would be a great gift idea and a promotion. So then I had to go back and print up 750 more copies. And I should tell you before I go any further than that, remember how I told you when I was in high school that I wanted to have something about fathers and sons? I eventually changed the story from football to baseball. I eventually changed the locale from southeastern Iowa to northwestern Iowa to Bancroft and to Cherokee and to Storm Lake and to Emmitsburg and to Bancroft. I said Bancroft. Remsen and Lorenz, they're all in here. But I also wanted to have something about ghosts in it. I don't know about you, but I believe in spirits, particularly in Bancroft, Iowa. Bancroft has, I think, I thought it was the most glorious church in Iowa until I was in Remsen last night and I saw their church. Have you all ever seen that church in Remsen? It's incredible. Have you seen it?
It's been a long time.
Long time, but amazing. Well, the church in Bancroft, when you walk out of Bancroft St. John, you immediately, about 100 yards out the back door, there's a baseball park. I call it also a house of worship. Both of these institutions in Bancroft, the church and the baseball field, are open 24 hours a day. You can visit those and make a visit in the Catholic Church or go down to the baseball field. If you go late at night, you can see this kind of white, vaporous sort of fog come up off the infield. And I swear that if you sit and look at it long enough, you can see human shapes and forms and faces and people perhaps rounding the bases. And that's what I saw anyway. I'm kind of daffy, but the Hmong people believe this. If you ever go to a Hmong funerals are 24 hours long. And if you're a Yang, there's only 18 names. If you're a Yang, if you're a Vang, if you're a Vu, if you're a Zhang, the expectation is all of your family clan has to come because it's a lot of work. They have to encourage or push that spirit to go back where its placenta is buried, underneath the cottage or the house that they were born in Laos. And if they don't all pull together and work hard and make that happen, that spirit will linger around. And the ghosts in my story are friendly spirits. The Hmong ghosts are kind of mischievous. They'll take things. They'll misplace things. They'll scare you. So you want to work hard to get that spirit going. And so anyway, the Hmong people believe in ghosts. My son is an international trader who reads, writes, and speaks fluent Mandarin. He took me to China, and whenever we walked into a beautiful temple, they had these stoops that you had to step over. And I asked the monks at each place just to make certain. I said, why do you have to step over a stoop to get into a temple? And they said, so the ghosts can't come in. Ghosts don't have feet. So the ghosts can only go as far as as the stoop, but they can't get into the temple. So I thought if 1 billion people over in China believe in ghosts, and if these Hmong people that I was working with believe in ghosts, and I believe in ghosts, I really do, spirits, and that's partly from my mother, who Jean Drew knows and Joanne knows. You know that she believed in ghosts and spirits and presence of people. So I thought, okay, I'm going to add that onto the story of fathers, sons, and now the Holy Ghost of baseball, that there's these ghosts up in Bancroft, Iowa that aren't quite ready to leave yet until they get a state championship of one kind or another. And in Bancroft, they had a coach named V.J. Meyer who had coached there for 46 years. It would have been 50, but he was gone into World War II for 4 years. He was the winningest coach of all time. Nobody before or since has even come close, because in Bancroft they played spring baseball, they played summer baseball, and they played fall baseball. And this paper, Gene, I don't know if you saw it, that was coming around chronicles that success. It lists all of those state tournaments. There was just one problem. He never won a summer state championship. They would go, as a matter of fact, there was a period of time where they went 4 years in a row. They got to the championship game and they would lose. Well, finally they were playing Key of Lansing the 5th year in a row, and it was 3-1 in the bottom of the 7th. They had 1 out. They just needed 2 more outs to go. It was a beastly hot day. I believe it was down in Ankeny. Beastly hot day. V.J. Meyer had a bad heart. This was in 1980. And he just wanted to finish that game and win that championship and retire. And they needed 1 more out. And Key of Lansing tied the game. It went into 14 innings. This is all written up in the paper too. And they lost 4-3. So right after that, V.J. Meyer retired from Bancroft baseball. As soon as he retired, he died. He had a heart attack and died. And for me, that character of V.J. Meyer, who's in my story, was a little bit like Moses. You know, Moses led the people, the Jewish people from Egypt to the Promised Land. It took 40 years. He never got to see the Promised Land. He died right before they crossed over into the Promised Land. And that's what happened with Meyer, because the very next year they went back again. They played Norway. Have you ever heard of a movie called The Final Season? It's the story of the Norway baseball program there. They played Norway in Bancroft St. John, played them in 1980 and beat them, and they finally won their summer state championship, but V.J. Meyer was dead and gone. So I hope you think that that makes for a good story. Remember, we started this off by saying 2 things. A good story involves a person who makes a trip or a stranger comes to town. I'll just tell you one more very quick story. My story is told from the perspective of a stranger who comes to town. At all of those correctional facilities that I told you about, there were really tough kids, guys with muscles bulging out of their sleeves. I don't know what you'd call them, greasers, pinball type guys, those guys you see that that don't have an ounce of fat on them, that are bigger and strong, and they were always fighting each other to prove who was the strongest. There were those guys. There were these voluptuous, I hate to say it, high school girls whose bodies were spilling out of their clothing. All these colorful, bright, engaging kids. But there was always one white kid with a pasty, kind of pimply complexion, thin, brownish blonde kind of hair that was combed in bangs, braces, and sort of pudgy. There was always at every one of these places. And everybody, they always wondered, how did that guy get in here? So he didn't have to fight, nor did he want to fight to prove himself. These other kids kind of figured maybe he poisoned his family or something, and so they always let this guy kind of go. And my story starts off, if we had time, but it's been 45 minutes. If we had time, I would read you, but the story starts off with this young man, TJ, a 14-year-old, who's been in every kind of correctional facility that I just described that I worked at. And he's been kicked out of every one of them, and he gets one more chance. And rather than take that chance, he's from Denver, Colorado. His mother brings him to Bancroft, Iowa. And Bancroft, Iowa is the most god-awful place that this kid has ever seen. He's been, as I say, he's been in every jail, every treatment program, but he hates Bancroft. It's really boring. And he wants to do anything he can to get out of there, and he actually does start doing some things. But he starts working or falls under the spell of some old people. So that's the storyline that takes place. And when I talked about a story where somebody makes a trip, in this experience, an entire town makes a trip. They're all going to go to the state tournament. All 732 people in Bancroft are going to make this trip. Even the people in Sunset Estates, that's the name of a real a place that I heard of in Northwest Iowa. So I just love that. Sunset Estates, where the elderly live. Even all the residents of that, even the people with dementia are going to go to that game, because in my story, baseball heals even dementia. So even the people who are watching that game for that one day, they know what's going on and they participate in it. And baseball heals all. So that's sort of a rough idea of what's happening here. And why don't we stop and take a break and just let you talk now about anything I've said that resonates with you, or do you have questions about or observations you'd like to make about baseball or Northwest Iowa? Yes, Joanne.
I started off. The only thing, I read the book, as I told you, and there's only one person that didn't go to that game, or maybe one or two that didn't go, and that was the lady who rang the bells.
Right. So the question is, there was a couple of people who stayed behind. One of them was, every small town has, it doesn't have to be Bancroft, I could ask you, has a church lady, somebody who kind of runs the church. It's not the priest, it's this lady usually who kind of makes certain that everything goes. And there is one lady who stays behind. She usually goes to all the games, but this one time she stays behind. And she's a lady. When in Emmitsburg, Iowa, where my mom was from, there was a barber named McCarthy. And that's who I named in my story. This barber had something called resting tremors. I don't know if you've ever seen him. Gene, do you know him? He had a barber shop right down the street. Yes, exactly, right down near that store. And this man's arms went like this all the time until you put something in him, like a clippers or whatever. And then, I don't know how this disease works or whatever, but then they were good. And I'll never forget, as a kid, I went in to get a haircut once. I saw him and I was terrified. And he cut my hair. He did a good job. And then when he was all done, he said, "Now I'm going to give you something that you've never had before. I'm going to give you your first shave with one of those sharp things." And he said, "Hold on a second." He put the scissors over on the table and he said, "Wait a second, hold on." And he went over and he got a hot towel and he put that on me. And I'll never forget him, reaching for that really sharp razor and coming over, and he gave me a shave. So that's a guy from Emmitsburg, Iowa, who found his way into my story. And the woman that you just described, I worked at Henry High School. There was an old coach named Coach Roger French, who he was in his 80s when he came over to Henry to coach football. He had coached at Brigham Young University, and Brigham Young was playing Florida State one time in a football game. And a guy named Chris Weinke, I guess nobody here would even know him, he was a quarterback. He ran into him. And French was on the sidelines looking at a play that they were going to run, so he wasn't paying attention. And this guy, Weinke, hit him. Weinke was from Cretin-Durham Hall in St. Paul, and crushed his hip and broke his knee. And this coach, Roger French, for the rest of his life, he walked like that woman that you described. He would say, he'd go like this, he'd walk, he'd go, "Ow, owie, ow, 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 ow." And that's just how my woman in this story walks over every day, and she rings the church bells and takes care of the church. Every single step she takes hurts her, and she says something and then she stops and catches a deep breath and always keeps going. So that's a character in the story. When my father was at St. Therese, there was a woman, a very wealthy woman named Mary, believe it or not, Mary, who lived there. And she was 96 years old, but one of these women that she had red hair, I think she dyed it, and she wore these very colorful sort of, I call them muumuus, but it's like yeah. And she ordered everybody around, and she would call my dad over, and she called him boy, because he was younger than her, and she'd say, come here. And then she'd sit him down, and she'd get right in his face, and she'd say, John, here's what I want you to do. And so she ran the place, and so that's a character in my story. That in what I really tried to do was make this story, the men are simply tools of the women. The women are the ones who really run the town and run the church. And I think I can tell you this without ruining the story. My priest at the end, when my dad was in this nursing home, we had Lutheran ministers who would come in, and we would go to a prayer service just for something to do. And these, so we started receiving the Lutheran Eucharist and drinking the Lutheran wine from a female pastor. And so for me, it was the same service. I sometimes think Lutherans are better Catholics than Catholics are. And so in my story, this priest who's overwhelmed and knows he's being shipped out soon just starts giving some of his sacramental Eucharist and last rite, the chrism, to this woman. I can't I've gotten Catholic newspapers to review this, but any prestigious Catholic magazine I've tried, and they said, oh no, this is way, way outside the Catholic orthodoxy. You're having women administer the sacraments? Are you out of your mind? Do you think we're going to write a review on that? And so, but the Catholic Globe people read it, and they loved it. And if you listen to Catholic radio, I'm being interviewed now. You can listen to the radio with Joanne Fox. But I can't get a good Catholic review. And this is a very Catholic story. All 7 sacraments, from baptism to holy orders to extreme unction, remember that one, the last rites, they're all in here. They're all practiced in the course of a baseball season and through the lens of baseball. So that's a long answer to a very short question from Joanne Lenan, who this presentation is dedicated to. Any other questions?
Well, you said you couldn't, it was very important to find somebody to proofread.
Yes.
So the guy didn't work out, and then you went ahead and self-published. Who proofread it for you?
Well, when I got the big, I tell people, I know how to make a small fortune selling novels. The trick is to start with a very large fortune. That's how you end up with a small fortune, making a small fortune. So when I got money from my Uncle Pat, I went over to a publisher in Edina, Minnesota, and I said, take this and publish it, and hurry, because my dad isn't well. And they said, do you understand it's going to cost $3,000 for us to edit this? And I said, I got it. Do you understand it's going to cost $1,500 to put a nice cover on this and figure all that out? No problem. We are going to charge you $1,000 to register this with the Library of Congress and to do all the that work. Okay. To typeset all this is going to cost something. That's fine. I got the money. So they did all of that. It's my advice to writers is find somebody and pay them to edit. If you ask your best friend or your wife or somebody down the street, no matter what they say, you'll hate them for the rest of your life. It can be just even something like, well, did you like it? And you look at them, and if they take a deep breath or if they turn away for a second, you want to strangle them. And so, but if you pay somebody, then the people that are used to getting money are very sensitive and very good, and really good editors build you up somehow by tearing your work apart. I don't know how it works, and that's what happened. I had a young woman with this little publishing house. Her name was Angela Weekman, who looked at my stuff, and she said, this is really good. As she was constantly saying, but you got to take this out, you misspelled this, you needed a period here instead of a comma. But she just kept saying, wow, this is amazing. And if it's a good editor, you believe that. And it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I should take you back. The guy who savaged me, J.F. Powers, his big complaint was that I hadn't told the reader where this story was happening. I wanted to write a story that everybody anywhere could think, well, that's my town in North Carolina, or that's my town in, but the way you do it is so he was right all along. The way you do that is you describe in excruciating detail that town in North Carolina, or that town in Texas, or in my case, that town in Northwest Iowa. If you do a good enough job describing that one town, then people in Cylinder think, oh, that's the Cylinder parish priest, or that's the Cylinder baseball coach, or that's the Des Moines coach. And so I've had people who say, I just want to tell you that your character, the egg, is an Iron Ranger. Who did you know on the Iron Range of Minnesota? Because you described a typical Iron Ranger. So that's really good to hear. That means I did a pretty good job describing that guy. And I had an interview with an Austin radio station about 2 weeks ago, and this guy, before I got on the air, he said, look, I'm going to be honest with you. As I read this, I thought I was reading my personal story. When I graduated from high school, in my little town in Minnesota, we had a quarries that we went out to, and we drank, and we smoked marijuana. And he said, even the way you describe the quarries, that's just exactly like how our quarry. He said, I constantly had to stop myself and say, hold on a second, did I grow up with this guy? And then he got on the radio station. His name is John Wright. You can listen to it if you want. And he said the same thing in front of his audience, that he just couldn't believe it. So I've had a number of people tell me that, and so I hope that as you read it, you'll have that same feeling that you lived this life at one time. So any other questions?
This is away from your book, I'm sorry, but who wrote the poem?
Oh, the poem was written by the editor of the Bancroft Register. It's called Tommy. It was written and read at his funeral, and it's the most beautiful poem that I've ever read about war. And if you don't mind, as long as we're being filmed here, I used to have this memorized. I hope I can read this. I might not be able to. It is. Hey, that's a good idea. I'll try to read this if I can't. I usually have. Would you be able to, Julian? I'll start off. It's called Tommy. Don't say a world moved, a nation rose on Tommy's death. Just say he smiles no more, and he's cold as winter's breath. He is no more, though he was youth, his story ends. He did the things he must for home and friends, and that is all. Don't say he gave his life or sought the light of some ideal. At 20, men don't wish to give a thing so real. Just say his life was snatched before the start, because the world said, do your duty, bear your heart, and that is all. Don't prate of mock heroics, only briefly say he did the thing he had to do. He fought that day, to live. He lost a game he'd hoped to win because conventions say you fight or sin, and that is all. Won't say we're proud he died for this, our cause, or that there's compensation and applause from fellow men. Just say we love him now as then, and pray youth won't be sacrificed again. let that be all. Yeah, that's my favorite poem. It really says it all. It was done by the editor of the Bancroft Register, Harold Clark. His children have told me that I also nailed this story, that I got it right there. His sons were pitchers for the Bancroft team. So that's encouraging to hear that. And so now, here's where I am at this point in my life. When I leave here, I'll get in my car, I'll get back on Highway 71 and go north up to, all the way up to the Twin Cities. That's where I live. My wife got in a car accident today. She's fine, but she crashed the car somehow. So that'll be one of the first things we talk about, is what happened. I haven't even had a chance today because I've been racing from Library to the Sugar Bowl in Storm Lake, which is selling this now, and the Rotary Club and everything else. So I'll check in with her, and then tomorrow I'll take a picture of that was taken of me at the Sioux Rapids Library, where I came with a relative married to Boom, and send it to the Sioux Rapids paper. They want to write a story. And then I'll keep pushing. I'm hoping that, I've told you I'm trying to get a national audience. There's a newspaper called The Catholic Worker out of New York City. Do you all know Dorothy Day? My Catholic story will appeal to them. They're reading it. They haven't said no. I've called them twice and sent a couple of letters. And I'm hoping that will be in the June, July issue of The Catholic Worker. So that would really be big, and that will help with circulation. But in the meantime, are there any other questions? We've actually been just about 60 minutes, which is good for me. Yeah, unfortunately, usually it's my wife who just kind of goes like this, stop, cut, and she physically comes up and says, no, you're done. So she's not here. So this book now is here at the library. I hope I think it'll be ready by tomorrow. I hope you'll check it out and read it. I know you'll like it. And then let Joanne know what you think about it. Yeah, so yeah.
It's for sale, yes.
You're doing good stuff.
You said you had to print another 750. How many do you have left, Edward?
The 750 sold really quickly because I gave 200 to the Hmong gentleman. So then I had to do 1,000 copies. And now these are kind of coming along. I'm coming back to Northwest Iowa on Saturday, June 2nd. It's the 70th anniversary of Memorial Park in Bancroft. They're playing the same team that they played 70 years ago, Albert Lee Lakers. My dad played in that game, and my cousin, John Devine. And so I'll be at that game. I'll be at the Bancroft Museum from 9 till 12, and then at the game at 7 o'clock that night. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I had a great time in Storm Lake and all the places in between. Thank you all. I salute the holiness within you, and thank you for having me here. This is one of the nicest receptions I've ever received. I'm just grateful. Thank you to this gentleman who's been filming us, so that hopefully people, I believe that the characters in my story, they're all real life characters to me, that they live as long as we remember them, as long as we tell their story, and as long as we say their name. And those names are very powerful names. And so I hope you will read this and share your stories and share your legacies. That's what this book is about, legacies. How do you want to be remembered? So thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.